The real work of relationships isn't what most people think. It's not just about getting better at communication, planning those date nights, or even having those weekly check-ins. Though, don't get me wrong, all those things are awesome.
Awesome.
The real work is growing and maturing beyond what comes automatically to you. We all have these sort of knee-jerk impulsive reactions. And you felt that, right? That hardwired response that just literally takes over your body. It's your default way of being when things get tough. Therapist Terry Real calls this your stance.
And your stance might look different from your partner's. Maybe it's trying to control through harshness or withholding. Maybe it's controlling by leaning out, stonewalling, or shutting down. Maybe you just freeze like a deer in headlights and then you can't find a single word to say. Or maybe it's something else entirely, but whatever it is, I bet you've seen it show up 1,000 times. Some of you who are listening know exactly what your stance is. You can feel that runaway train coming and it's like there's no stopping it.
I love runaway train.
Others might not know what their stance is yet, maybe because looking in the mirror feels a little too hard still.
Yeah, the mirror is rough. But here's the truth. The only way to truly heal and strengthen a relationship is to face this automatic stance head on and do the work to heal it. Today, we're talking about these automatic reactions, where they come from, and how they're created. Because when you understand what's driving your stance and what's behind your partner's stance, it opens the door to compassion, to understanding, and the ability to choose a different response instead of being hijacked by this uncontrollable reaction.
Last week, we talked about big T trauma and how it shakes up our nervous system and makes us less resilient to stress. And we shared with you one of our amazing couples' journeys back to finding love again. And it's an incredible story and it set us up for today's discussion. So if you did miss last week's episode, definitely encourage you to go back and listen to it because it was a powerful one.
Yeah. This week, we're going deeper. We're exploring all kinds of trauma, both big and small, and how they shape our automatic behaviors that can pull our marriages apart. But don't worry, we're not stopping just there. We're also talking about how to take your marriage back. That's what's coming up next on Master Your Marriage. To get us started this week, I want to share a story, and it's from Terry Real's book, Us, and it's about a couple named Dan and Julia. Dan, well, he's this pathological compulsive liar, and he is relentlessly evasive, always dodging the truth. And as you'll see, Dan isn't always his best self when he does this.
So in their first therapy sessions, Terry asks Dan, "Did Julia bring you to therapy?" And for probably the fourth time in less than 4 minutes, Dan sidesteps the question. Well, not bring me exactly, but she strongly suggested it. Classic Dan.
He's slippery, that guy.
This is the kind of doublespeak that Julia's been dealing with for years.
Terry knows this Dan is not a bad guy. In fact, he's a really nice guy. But this evasive thing that he does, this stance that he has, is the automatic way he shows up when things get just a little bit uncomfortable. And stances don't just appear out of nowhere. They're created for a reason. Terry suspects Dan either grew up watching someone slippery or he learned to dodge someone who's controlling. So he takes a stab at figuring out why. Who tried to control you when you're growing up? Terry asks.
Well, now Dan's quick to respond. Well, certainly not my father. He was checked out, totally passive, barely ever even there. Huh. So your mother ruled the roost then? Terry presses a little more. Oh, yeah. Yep, Dan says with an iron hand. And so Terry leans in a little bit. And so she ruled you. Dan shrugs it off. Well, I was a good actor, so I put up a really good front. Well, what was behind that front? Terry asked. Nothing disastrous, Dan replied. Some girls, some drinking, a little weed, but you know what? She never knew. I mean, after all, what you don't know can't hurt you, right?
And there it was. Right? Dan's relational stance in a single sentence. What you don't know can't hurt you. And he was still living that out every day in his marriage with Julia, dodging her questions, hiding the truth, and keeping her at arm's length.
Yep.
But then something shifted. A few weeks later, Dan and Julia show up in Terry's office. They're smiling, they're cuddling, they're holding hands. You two look happy, Terry says. We've had a breakthrough, Dan replies, and he's sort of happy about it. Here's what happened. Julia had sent Dan to the store with a grocery list of items, and true to form, Dan came home with almost everything.
Almost.
Except the milk, which I think every man just seems to forget the milk.
Mm-hmm. And Julia looked at the groceries after he got home. They're sitting on the table, and she looks at everything, and she looks at Dan, and she's like, "Where's the damn milk?"
In that moment, every muscle in Dan's body was screaming, "Just tell her they're out of milk. Just tell her you couldn't find it." But instead, he took a deep breath and he did something we're going to call heroic. He said, "I forgot."
Whoa.
Dan telling the truth?
Breakthrough.
There's a new one here.
And Julia actually burst into tears. And she said, "I have been waiting for this moment for 10 years.
Waiting for him to forget the milk?
Waiting for him to tell the truth."
Waiting for him to tell the truth. So what was really going on with Dan's lying and evading? It wasn't just this random behavior. It was a behavior that he created in response to some stressor in his life. You could probably call it a coping strategy, or what might be described as a compensating behavior. For Dan, it was his way of dealing with an intrusive, controlling parent.
And let's be honest, we all have some version of this compensating part of us in our relationship.
Oh, absolutely.
Trauma, whether that's been big traumas that we've experienced or small traumas or experiences that we've had, they shape us in profound ways. And it doesn't take very much to develop a coping strategy. Dan wasn't someone who was physically or sexually abused, but he grew up with a mom who ruled with an iron hand. And that was enough to wire his nervous system to adapt and to create this adaptation.
And here's the thing. These coping strategies that kept us safe as kids, they often become maladaptive as we're adults. And here's where it gets interesting. When trauma gets triggered in adulthood, we don't relive the original experience. Dan wasn't sitting there thinking about his mother's control. Instead, he was simply acting out the coping strategy he had developed as a kid.
Yep.
Yeah.
So this part of us, the one that learned to cope and to compensate, is what Pia Mellody and Terry Real call the adaptive child.
That dang child keeps showing up.
It's the part of us that had to adapt to something as a child. It's the child version of you that figured out how to navigate something that was tough. And for Dan, he grew up with an intrusive parent. So his adaptive child learned to lie, to evade. But another kid in a similar situation might have created a different coping strategy. Maybe they would have built up walls to keep people out. Or maybe another child, let's say a child who maybe experienced abandonment. Maybe they grow up to be a super charismatic people pleaser in order to make sure no one ever leaves them again.
I feel that. Yeah, I feel that one. So let's say this again because it's so important. The stance that you take into your adult relationships is the coping strategy your adaptive child developed when you were young, developed it to survive.
To survive, to get by, to cope with whatever.
Yeah.
And everyone's adaptive child looks different. Your stance might be cold or harsh.
Sort of walled off, right?
It could be dominating. It could be retaliatory. Oh. Maybe it's superiority. Maybe it leans into that contempt, or maybe it leans into inferiority. But here's the thing. It's not always aggressive. You know, we kind of tend to think of that maybe the adaptive child is always doing some aggressive behavior, but it might be the opposite. The adaptive child might be overly accommodating. It might be a charming seducer, or like Dan, it might just be evasive, a liar. And we can kind of look at all of these compensating behaviors and we can see how they might fit into one of three categories: either fighting, fleeing, or fixing. Does that sound a little bit like our conversation on the nervous system a couple weeks ago?
It does, absolutely.
Yeah, because we're going into essentially fight or flight. And so the dominating, harsh person, what are they doing? They're fighting. The people pleaser, what's he or she doing? They're fixing. They're fixing. And Dan, he was fleeing by trying to dodge the truth to avoid conflict.
Whatever your stance is, it kicks in almost every time that you're triggered. It's your default. It's your set point when stress hits you and takes over. For teenage Dan, the evasive stance kept him out of trouble with his mom, who was overly controlling. But as an adult, this stance was really costing him his relationship.
It's costing him everything. Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's get practical now. And let's talk about how you specifically can spot your adaptive child if you're not familiar already with who he or she is.
Oh, good. Let's find out.
So there's some clear telltale signs of the adaptive child that you can spot when you're starting to slip into that I'm not quite in my right mind state.
Right. Okay.
So first off, you'll know it because it's that automatic knee-jerk reaction. I'm sure you kind of already know that pretty well. It's what kicks in before you even have a chance to think.
You get flooded, you get triggered, like this thing happens. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And you might notice that you're in your adaptive child when a couple other signs, when you're harsh, for example, or when you're rigid. That's a big one. If your thinking starts to become really black and white, that's a big red flag that you're probably in your adaptive child. Also, your adaptive child loves to be right or certain. This is the way it is.
My way or the highway.
Instead of being humble or curious even about someone else. So if you catch yourself not even trying to understand your partner's perspective, or if you catch yourself losing empathy, losing compassion, chances are your adaptive child has taken the wheel.
Oh, man. And now when you're in your wise mind, that prefrontal cortex we talked about last week it's doing its job. It's balancing your limbic system.
Mm-hmm.
That's when you're empathetic, you're flexible, you're relaxed, you're humble, and you're open to seeing and accepting nuances.
Yes.
These are the qualities of your wise self. There are also qualities that are normally associated with emotional maturity, emotional intelligence, which we all agree are super important things in a healthy, thriving relationship.
Very important things. So here's the hard truth. A lot of us spend way more time in our adaptive child than we care to admit.
Absolutely.
Most of us are going around saying and thinking, I'm in my wise adult. Of course I am. But often we're just grown-up kids in adult bodies. And sadly, the world around us actually kind of rewards it. It really rewards it. I mean, think about it. How many social media debates have you seen online on Facebook or whatever, where you see people being humble, open, curious, willing to take in other perspectives? Very many?
Not many at all.
Not many. Most of those conversations are rigid, absolute. They're stuck in their stance.
Yeah, I'm right. And then the name calling starts.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think even worse is that I think society even celebrates the adaptive child. I think a lot of people are wildly successful in life, both financially and professionally, by operating from that place. But like Dan, it probably serves them really well in the office, at the job, outside. But when you come back home, it comes with a very high cost.
That's a high cost on personal relationships.
Yes.
I think. Yeah, absolutely. So let's circle back to trauma, specifically the little t traumas.
Mm-hmm.
Psychotherapists largely agree that trauma isn't always about a single catastrophic event. It's more often it's the buildup of hundreds of thousands of smaller moments. All of this accumulation of traumas can still be damaging.
Yeah.
For example, maybe you had a parent who constantly told you that you were a burden or you were not enough, or that your emotions maybe were too much to handle.
Yeah.
Or like Dan, you had a parent who was overly intrusive, or even the opposite. Maybe you had a parent that was completely walled off.
Right. So think now for a moment about your own childhood. Were you physically, emotionally, and intellectually nourished?
Maybe, right? Were you cuddled? Were you read to? Or were you taught how to understand and regulate complex emotions? I know I didn't have that.
Did you have someone you could turn to when you were hurting, when you were scared, when you were sad? Did you have someone who would help you to navigate those vulnerable, difficult moments in your life? Or were you left to kind of figure that stuff out on your own? I'm going to kind of share a story now about a client to illustrate this, these small T traumas, and not her real name as usual. We'll call her Jessica. And she came to me because she couldn't understand why she would freeze and stonewall and go essentially mute every time her husband brought up a need or some concern that he had in the relationship. Her husband was feeling emotionally starved in their marriage because Jessica would just check out at the first hint of a tough conversation. She would slip into what we've referred to in past episodes as hypoarousal, which just means that her body would shut down and she would retreat behind this imaginary massive stone wall that she had in her mind. That was Jessica's adaptive child, though. That was the adaptive child's behavior. But what, if you were to think about that, what was Jessica's child adapting to? That's the $1 million question. This is the behavior she's doing as an adult, but what was her child having to adapt to? Was she simply mimicking something that she saw growing up, or was it in response to something that was done to her? And the answer is, Jessica.
Both probably.
Yeah, Jessica had a great mother, a good mother, a kind mother, but her mother struggled herself to be able to handle big emotions. She would also flee. And so when it came to big emotions, whether it was her own emotions or whether it was her kids' emotions, her mom was at a total loss for how to handle that and what to do. And so when Jessica would have these big feelings as a child, she didn't have a mom that could guide her through them. In fact, her mom didn't even want to see them. Yeah. She didn't even want her to be around when she was having these big emotions. So her mom would say, you know what? Take that emotion, go up to your room, and you can go up there and figure out what to do with it.
Oh my gosh.
So as a little girl, Jessica's way of coping was to literally hide behind an actual wall in her bedroom until this, I guess, emotional chaos or this emotional storm in the house would pass.
Yeah. How do you create somebody who's walled off?
There you go.
There you go. It's not any surprise that in her marriage, she did pretty much the same thing.
Yep.
Now, she may not have physically left and, gone behind a wall in her bedroom, but she had built a fortress in her mind. And that's the thing about people who flee. They can literally be 2 feet away from you and be absolutely gone.
Totally gone.
That is the power of these little T traumas as they build up. They wire us in ways that will show up decades later in our relationships, and often the relationships that matter most.
Absolutely.
All right. We've unpacked the adaptive child, how it shows up, and how it's rooted in our childhood experiences. But now what? We know that these behaviors can hurt our relationships. What do we do to change them?
What do we do?
Yeah.
First things first, you have to be able to identify your relational stance.
Yeah.
What do you specifically do when the pressure is on or you feel backed into a corner? And you have to be willing to look in that mirror and be very honest, brutally honest with yourself. What is your go-to reaction? And then you can start to peel it back a little, trace it back. Did you see someone model that behavior growing up? Did someone do it to you? Or maybe you acted that way as a kid and no one set a boundary for you. No one guided you to do something differently.
That was just okay the way you did it, right? Yeah. Next thing you need to do is you need to face that inner child, which is looking in the mirror. And there are a few ways to do this, but only one option really works. Here's a couple of thoughts maybe that you have been trying out. Option one, just indulge it. Just let that automatic reaction run wild, whether it's raging, lying, hiding, or controlling, or maybe even people pleasing. Maybe another option would be to despise it. You shame or hate yourself for these behaviors, but here's the truth. There's no healing in harshness. You can't hate your inner child into happiness. You can't hate it into acting like a wise adult. The majority of people spend most of their life sort of bouncing back and forth between indulging their inner child and despising it. But honestly, neither of those options that we just presented will get us anywhere.
Nope. But there is one that will. There is a better way. Instead, it's time to actually meet your inner child and wrap your arm around your inner child. And
figuratively speaking.
And I actually do have a meditation on how to do this. By the way, you could reach out to me if you need a little help with it. But basically, in your imagination, you can wrap your arm around your child, your inner child, and from your grown-up wise self, you can have a compassionate conversation with that younger version of you. And you can say things like, I forgive you. You did your best with what you had. I'm so sorry that you went through what you went through. I'm sorry that I've been so hard on you. But here's the thing. I'm not going to let you act out in this marriage. You don't get to hurt my husband or my wife or my partner. I'm going to protect them and I'm going to care for them in a way that nobody did for you. And I'm so sorry that you didn't have that for you.
Yeah. And this figurative conversation, and we've done a couple of techniques like this, you might need to have this conversation more than once and then take it a step further and put this new work back into action. You're going to work on catching yourself right before you fall back into those old adaptive behaviors, much like Dan did with the milk. When every muscle in your body is screaming to react the same old way, just pause, just breathe, and don't ride that first wave of automatic reaction. We're going to wait for the second wave. We're going to wait for your wise adult to show up in your consciousness.
So when you're pausing, okay, you feel like Dan, what was his saying? Lie, lie, lie. Don't tell her the truth. Don't tell her the truth. Take that pause and maybe even think about it for a second. Am I about to lie again? Am I about to shut down again for the 900th time? Am I about to just retaliate and hit back harder because I got my feelings hurt a little bit? Or am I going to call on my wise adult to make a choice that actually puts my relationship first? In that moment when I have all these feelings going on because I'm in my limbic system, can I say to my partner, you know what? You are more important to me than these feelings that I'm having right now.
So, and I love it. And it's a quote that we shared many times on this show, the space between stimulus and response.
Yep. That is where you'll find your freedom.
Yeah.
That is where you're going to find your freedom from these automatic behaviors that are probably crushing your relationship.
Yeah. So one of our goals really is, can you expand the space between stimulus and response? Wait for your wise adult to show up.
Exactly.
Right? This is the work. This is the hard part, my friends. The real work of relationships. We're no longer destined to be passengers on the bus that's driven by our adaptive child who's just crashing into everything.
Yep.
With practice, we can shift from this sort of me centric child state to one where we remember, this is someone I love.
Yeah.
This is someone I care deeply about, and we can work this out.
We can work this out.
This is the day-to-day, moment-to-moment practice. It's not something that it's not a one and done. Just do once and it's over with. This is every day for the rest of your life. We spend time identifying these automatic behaviors, pause.
Yep.
Wait for your wise adult to show up, and then choose your relationship. Choose the other person.
Choose this relationship. Choose us. So today we explored how trauma, big and small, shapes the adaptive child. And we talked about, from Dan's lying all the way to Jessica's stonewalling. We saw how these childhood wounds that we all have had, because let's face it, nobody's perfect. No parents are perfect.
Yeah.
But they do create our relational stances. But here's the hope. By identifying those patterns and having compassion for our inner child and choosing wiser responses, we can take our relationships back.
Yeah,
we can
absolutely
take our marriages back. But again, it's moment to moment work. I always remember Terry Reel's quote. He always says, within each of us, we have this adaptive child, but we also have a wise adult. So which one am I going to choose?
Yeah. Which one do we choose today? So if you're struggling to do this on your own, we're here to help. Reach out to us at masteryourmarriage@gmail.com. We also offer tons of ways to work with us, work together, because we're passionate about saving marriages and strengthening families. Your past doesn't have to define your marriage anymore. You can show up as your wise, loving adult self.
If this episode hit home for you today, we would love to hear from you. You can find us on Instagram at Master Your Marriage. If you found it helpful, please leave us a 5-star review with a comment, because it really does help the algorithm, and we really appreciate it when you do. And if you feel like it would help somebody, please share it with someone else who might need it. Also, if you have ideas for future topics, or if you have suggestions for ways that we can make the show even better, please drop us a note at, again, masteryourmarriage@gmail.com.
Remember this week, be kind to each other, put each other first. It's the small things done often that make the biggest impact.